Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Jamie Weinstein Show at National Review Online. This is the second episode of a series of episodes I am hosting here at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California, as part of my Hoover Media Fellowship. That means they bring me out here and I get to spend a week on this beautiful campus talking to some of their very impressive scholars. My guest today is no exception. His name is Niall Ferguson. You've probably heard it, and that's because he may be the most famous history professor in the world. If he is not the most famous, he is certainly among the most famous. And we get into a lot of different issues in this episode, from what his thoughts are on the Trump administration, to why he believes Trump was elected president, to his new book, The Square in the Tower, Networks and Power from the Freemasons to Facebook, to the foreign policy of this administration and what is going on in the world. We also talk about his influences. I think you're really going to find this show interesting and even perhaps challenging to some of your views. Before we get to the episode, I, as always, ask you to please go to iTunes. If you enjoy what we're doing week in and week out on this show, please go to iTunes and rate the show. Give us a 5-star review. It is so much appreciated if you do that. It goes a long way for what we do here, for supporting what we do here. Also, if you have guests you'd like to see on the show or questions you would like me to ask guests that I announce will be on the show, you can tweet at me at Jamie_Weinstein, or go to jamieweinstein.com and email me. As much interaction as possible. That is my motto, or at least that's what I'm telling you my motto is. But that's where we stand for right now. So without further ado, I give you Mr. Niall Ferguson. Niall, thank you for joining the Jamie Weinstein Show.
It is a great pleasure, Jamie.
Let's begin where I have begun with many of the guests. We are just over a year into the Trump presidency. Has anything surprised you in year one?
I've been surprised at how many people who predicted with great confidence that the American tyranny had arrived and that the Republic was doomed, how few of those people have recanted, and how little real ideological change there's been, how few positions have shifted, despite the fact that the Trump administration clearly has not destroyed the institutions of the Republic. I've also been surprised by one thing I got wrong. I thought that after a year it would have normalized, that the Trump administration would have become a more normal administration in the way that most administrations do in their first year. The campaign people get set aside and the professionals take over, and that hasn't happened. If anything, the president's inimitable style has become more pronounced in the last few months. So I think I was wrong in thinking that it would normalize and become a regular administration. That has not happened.
Is that a good or a bad thing in your estimation?
I think it's a bad thing in domestic terms and a good thing in foreign policy terms. And I think the central sort of paradox of the Trump administration is that it is in great difficulties domestically, and yet it is doing really quite well abroad, which is often not the case. Quite often, administrations get better at domestic politics. At least they figure out Washington, but they do shockingly badly in foreign policy. That was the Obama administration, in essence. But this administration is at times on the point of self-destruction domestically, and yet it's achieving a remarkable amount on foreign policy. I'll give you some examples. Trump campaigned complaining that the Europeans didn't do nearly enough for their own defense and that NATO couldn't be taken for granted. They very quickly fell into line and started increasing their defense spending. Trump said that Iran could no longer with impunity, pursue its various interventions around the Middle Eastern region, and the Iranian regime suffered quite a severe domestic crisis not long after that, and I think is under intense pressure at the prospect of the United States leaving the nuclear deal that the Obama administration struck. North Korea, which the Obama administration completely failed with, has been forced under a combination of military and economic pressure to the negotiating table. And China, which has had a free ride on the world economy since it joined the World Trade Organization, is finally being forced to face real pressure on trade. That's a pretty impressive list of successes. And I think these successes stem partly from President Trump's abnormality. He throws the counterparty off balance. They don't know quite what to make of him. They can't decide whether to overestimate him or underestimate him. And he thereby gets results. As I put it the other day, it turns out that the madman theory of diplomacy really works if they think you're mad. But at home, this doesn't work so well. And the list of domestic difficulties is a long and familiar one. Just think of how things look for the midterms. It's hard to believe that the Republicans will retain control of the House. And for the first time in recent weeks, people have begun to fret about the Senate. The Mueller inquiry rumbles on. The president's legal team increasingly resemble the Keystone Cops. And you just wonder how this doesn't end up being a dumpster fire of world historical proportions. The president's own popularity has rallied since December, and yet as his approval rating rises, his domestic difficulties deepen. And I think the name Stormy Daniels alone suffices to sum up the scale of the problem. So it's an extraordinary administration and very unusual. It hasn't normalized. It remains like The Apprentice writ onto the Washington stage. The president refuses to settle down into anything resembling a normal presidency. There's a kind of open war with what some people call the deep state. And this dumpster fire continues to deliver more foreign policy success in a year than the Obama administration delivered in 8 years.
I want to delve a little bit into the foreign policy questions a little later, but let's take a step back. Have you ever had the opportunity to meet Donald Trump?
I have never had that opportunity.
Why do you think that he won, particularly the primary? There was a stage of 16 very qualified candidates, and I've asked this to many of my guests. Was it primarily more the unorthodox position he took on various issues, immigration, trade, or was it more the brand, the kind of the persona that he built up over 40 years, whether true or not, as the world's greatest businessman, and his promise to people that if you just put their faith in him, he'll make all their problems go away?
Well, Jamie, I think it's very important when we answer questions about 2016 to remember what we thought at the time. As somebody who writes a weekly column, I can't deny the things I got wrong. And I underestimated him very badly at the beginning of that primary series. At first, back in January 2016, I thought he wouldn't survive contact with real votes, with real primaries, and I was completely wrong about that. But I learned quickly as I watched him in action three things. One, he has an unerring instinct for the weakness of the counterparty. It's extraordinary. It's as if he just can smell it. And so he found the weakness in each of his adversaries in a way that was uncanny. That's his superpower. And it's why, of course, his foreign policy is going well, because he just keeps doing it. Just as he found Jeb Bush's weak spot, I think he's found Xi Jinping's. The second thing I observed was that Trump's network that he'd built up on television and before that in the media as a tycoon socialite translated very nicely and easily into politics. It meant that he brought a lot of name recognition to the table, and that gave him a head start when it came to media coverage. One thing that hasn't been commented on enough is the feedback loop between social media and mainstream media. Trump would appear on Morning Joe, their social media would go crazy, and they would give him more airtime, and that proved extraordinarily potent pretty early on. The third and most important thing, though, was that Trump was the only candidate in the Republican field who was prepared to challenge the consensus on globalization. And one might add multiculturalism. Here was a candidate who would bash immigration, bash free trade, bash multiculturalism, overtly talk about Mexico, about China, about Islam. None of the other candidates, because they'd all gone through the conventional school of politics, would go near those issues with their talking points. And as that was the kind of stuff that Republican voters craved, he won on policy. I think people forget that on the key policy issues that really moved voters, throughout 2016, Donald Trump consistently met the needs of voters and of course, particularly Republican activists.
So you believe that it was the issue, that he saw the issues as opposed to him shaping what he thought were the issues are and led the voters to those issues?
I think that on a number of issues, and particularly on trade, Trump has been remarkably consistent over the years. Remember, Trump's been around a long time trying his hand at politics. You can go all the way back to the 80s, and yet it never really took off. And this was not his first rodeo, but it was the first rodeo he won. And I think what had changed was not his message, which had never really varied that much, except for Japan delete and replace with China. I mean, that had changed, but the basic message was the same as the late 80s. But what changed was that the electorate finally had had enough of globaloney, and they'd had enough of being told that there could be an amnesty on immigration, and they'd had enough of all of that. And partly, I think, because the financial crisis had kicked a lot of voters pretty hard where it hurts, they'd reached a kind of point of disillusionment with establishment talking points. And I got an education from my friend Jerry Blake, ex-Marine Corps, ex-NYPD, who is the guy who explained Trump to me when all the professors at Harvard and Stanford were missing the point completely, with almost no exceptions. Jerry said to me, and this was at the time, I think, of the New Hampshire primary, Neil, he tells it like it is, and Neil, he's going to shake things up. And there were people all over America who were thinking those exact same thoughts. And so Trump's moment had finally arrived.
I was reading your new book over the last 24 hours, The Square and the Tower. Am I wrong to say, though, I get an impression from the book, or at least a theme towards the end, that is almost it's that there should be gatekeepers, that these networks, this populism is not good, gatekeeping is good, the establishment sometimes provides order. Am I misreading that?
The book says you can't have a world based exclusively on networks, on distributed, decentralized networks, that there has to be some hierarchical structure. I'm mostly talking in that part of the book about the international system and arguing against the idea that you can have a networked world. I'm arguing here against everybody from Anne-Marie Slaughter to Mark Zuckerberg. So that argument is more about the liberal proposition that we're going to build this awesome global community. Everybody's going to be connected and will solve all the world's problems. I mean, that was always, I think, phony and both for historical reasons and on the basis of network science, unlikely, if not impossible, to materialize. On domestic politics, I'm ambivalent. At one level, and I felt the same way about Brexit, I'm perturbed at the prospects of where the populist revolt may lead. In particular, I worry about an equal and opposite reaction that swings the countries in question, the US and the UK, to the left. Populism has unintended consequences. We know that from history. After all, populism, once it burnt out, had opened the door to progressivism in the United States. In the wake of Brexit, the politician who surged politically was Jeremy Corbyn, the most left-wing leader in the history of Labour. So populism is unnerving because you don't quite know where it's going to lead you, and certainly the people voting for it are quite reckless. He'll shake things up is understandable. If you're frustrated with the status quo, you want to shake things up. But, some things, when you shake them up, break. And so there's a risk of breakage. On the other hand, when I asked myself on the eve of the election on November 8th, 2016, which side was I on? Who would I rather line up with? I'm not a citizen yet, so I couldn't vote. But I asked myself, if you line up all the people who are going to vote for Hillary Clinton and line up all the people who are going to vote for Donald Trump, whose side are you on? Whom do you identify with? It was easy. I was with Jerry. I was with Jerry because I felt deeply disillusioned with the establishment, with all that Hillary Clinton personified. And I felt the system needed shaking up.
Well, what if we threw a third option in there, which was there was maybe not numerically large, but in kind of the space that you run in, there was a third group which were never Trumpers that some of them decided not to vote or vote for a third party candidate. If you put that option in there, where do you think you would have stood?
I went from never Trump to what the hell, okay, Trump, in the course of 2016, and rather as I went from Remain to what the hell Brexit, in the sense that for me the voters who supported Trump and voted for Brexit were giving vent to strong pent up feelings, and there was a kind of catharsis as they did that was very necessary. I run the counterfactual of a Clinton victory in my imagination. And I reflect on how those people, how Jerry and his ilk would have responded. I think they would have rejected and repudiated that result. They would never have regarded it as legitimate. They would have believed that the election had been rigged, and we would be in a much worse place in our politics today. So, is
that because Trump would have led the charge that it was rigged?
Oh, yes. Unquestionably. And I think there would have been a very poisonous atmosphere very quickly. So
what does that say, though, about Jerry and about Trump? I mean, I don't know Jerry, but that does seem to be a problem with the electorate, that they would have not accepted the outcome of the election,
right,
more so than the candidate.
Well, I think that's correct, and the degree of disillusionment amongst Trump voters was very great, which is why more than 40% are essentially still with him through thick and thin, despite the evidence of mendacity and potentially even criminality. This is a big problem. If a political establishment has taken the electorate to this point that around 40% of people wouldn't have accepted the other side's victory, we were in a mess before Trump even walked into the White House. So I think it's better on balance for us to run these populist experiments, get it out of everybody's system, and discover that the populist remedies are not as potent as advertised. Mm-hmm. If we can come out of this without swinging to the other extreme and electing Bernie Sanders or some similar left-wing populist, then I think that's going to be a good outcome. You really want your populists to be mugged by reality at some point, but not so badly mugged that they decide to try the far left. The center in this country, or let's call it the political establishment, the Clintons and the Bushes, took the voters for granted and felt contempt for a significant proportion of them, the deplorables. And I think the deplorables would have been even more deplorable if they'd not had their opportunity, had their win, got their man in the White House. And now for Jerry and all the people like him, there is this kind of strange and at times disconcerting spectacle of the Trump presidency, which is certainly, and they would be the first to admit it, not going smoothly. So I'm enough of an optimist about the United States to think that we'll take something valuable from this about why the Constitution was set up the way it was. For those people who were in a state of panic that we talked about at the beginning, who thought the Republic is dead, it's all over, this is American tyranny, like my friend Tim Snyder at Yale, or Andrew Sullivan, for that matter, one of my oldest friends who predicted American tyranny.
And a guest on the show.
And always a brilliant man to talk about these things with. I think at some point they have to admit that the system is working and that, as the founders foresaw, non-saintly men would become president. It doesn't require that the president be a saint in the Constitution, and that the separation of powers, the rule of law, would operate, and those situations to constrain the commander-in-chief, the head of the executive branch. I think that's what's happening. And it's messy, but we're not on the brink of tyranny in the way that, for example, Sinclair Lewis imagined in It Can't Happen Here. It isn't happening here. Jack Goldsmith, my Hoover colleague, got this right early on when he said that this would be a test of the system, but the system would pass it. And I think at this point, it'll say on Trump's epitaph, I fought the law and the law won.
Well, as a previous guest here, Jamie Kirchick, said, it turns out that Trump isn't a fascist, he's a golfer.
Right, and the analogy with fascism always was wrong. And I said it at the time when these debates were doing the rounds in 2016. This is a complete category error. It's populism, it's not fascism. Fascists are about martial music, invading countries. It's about actual war. Populism is about trade war. That's different, very different. And it involves a far less frontal assault on the Constitution. Fascists overturn the Constitution so that they can stay in power. That isn't going to happen here.
But do you think, in the parallel I kind of mentioned tongue-in-cheek that Jamie Kirchick said, the idea was that, if Trump had the levers to do that, if he felt that he could do it and maybe was focused enough and wasn't, off playing golf, do you think that he's the type of person who admires authoritarians and, given the opportunity, if it existed, he would extend his term for another term or go remove the libel laws, like he wanted to make libel cases easier?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think that's almost certainly true, though I don't know him well enough to be certain. But the whole point is that those levers don't exist. They were designed not to exist. The striking thing when one goes back and reads the Federalist Papers is the extent to which the founders worried about this scenario. Alexander Hamilton writes about how a demagogue will likely come to power, and that's what always happens. They knew their history, these people, and they knew that republics always have this problem. So they set it up pretty cleverly so that even if the president had the instincts of a demagogue, there just wouldn't be those levers. And that's why those people who constantly compare the United States with Central Europe, whether it's Central Europe in the 1930s or now, are just missing the point. This is not Central Europe, and it's designed not to fall into the pitfalls that have characterized experiments with democracy in Central Europe over the years.
Let's take a tour of the world a little bit and get your thoughts. You mentioned China earlier. You thought that Trump has found kind of the lever on the Chinese leader. What did you mean by that? And do you imagine that both the United States and China can rise without coming into conflict, or do you think conflict between the two countries is inevitable?
On your first question, I think that Trump knows the weakness of the Chinese regime, and that weakness is that they're much more dependent on trade, on what we sometimes call the liberal international order than the United States is. And therefore a trade war has very asymmetrical payoffs. It hurts China quite a lot more than the United States. And the Chinese can't afford an exogenous shock in the form of 25% US tariffs on a whole bunch of their exports. They're too insecure about their own population to want to risk a significant slowdown in growth. So they're vulnerable. They don't like this confrontation, and I think they will fold on key issues in order to avoid a protracted trade war. It took somebody with Trump's intuition to see that because prior administrations were altogether too respectful of China and too inclined to accept the argument that, well, as an emerging market, China needed special rules and the WTO membership shouldn't be conditional on its fully opening its economy. So the Chinese have had this great free ride. They've enjoyed explosive growth. By one measure, they're now a larger economy than that of the United States. And it's essentially been on the basis of a system skewed in their favor. They are still protectionist in a whole range of different areas of their economy that they want to protect. So Trump has called them out on this, and I think that's long overdue. And I think he will win because as long as he isn't too hasty in settling for a headline when he needs the detail to be right, I think they are going to concede on key points. Does this lead to conflict? Your second question. are we doomed to fall into the Thucydides trap, the theme of my old friend Graham Allison's recent book, Destined for War? Well, the book argues that there's a probability that a rising power and an incumbent power will collide, but it's not a certainty. There are plenty of cases when that didn't happen, even if in the majority of Graham Allison's cases it did happen. I think that there is nothing that says if you're in a trade war today, you'll be in a real war X years from now. It's perfectly possible that you can have the trade war, reach an agreement. After all, a trade war isn't actually a war. Reach an agreement. I think that will happen pretty soon. Notice, Vice Premier Liu He is on his way to another meeting with the US representatives pretty soon. So this ain't over, and I think that the speed with which he's heading to DC suggests that they are, as I suspected on the basis of my meetings in Beijing last week, they want to settle this. So I think there's a reasonable probability that the US and China will settle the trade war pretty soon. They'll settle it in ways that are advantageous to the United States. And on other issues, ranging from North Korea to the South China Sea to Taiwan, the Trump administration is not going to be as confrontational as other administrations have been in the past, or as confrontational as the Hillary Clinton administration would have been. Because I don't think that Trump really cares that much about some of these strategic issues. I mean, he's all set to withdraw troops from South Korea. He wants the nuclear deal. He's prepared to make concessions for that. Would Donald Trump go to war over Taiwan? I don't think so.
Do you, speaking of North Korea, that's my next area. Do you think that Trump deserves the credit, the madman theory, that's why they're coming to the table? Some commentators argue that they've done this before. They've pledged potential denuclearization. Do you think this time is different and that's attributable to Trump?
He definitely deserves the credit for the fact that these negotiations are happening, that the North Korean and South Korean leaders just met. I think that is something that almost no important player denies. The South Koreans acknowledge it. The Chinese acknowledge it.
There are some people that argue, and you can find them on Twitter, professors of so and such, saying that North Korea achieved what it wanted, and now they're going to negotiate. This has been the game plan for a long time. I never had heard. This is the first I've heard that, but that's some arguments trying to take credit away from.
What is perfectly true is that in the past, Kim Jong-un's predecessor did much of the same things that he's done, said many of the same things, and then welched on the deal. I think it's perfectly possible that could happen again. So we can't possibly trust this man, and any deal that is done when Trump meets him has to be based on extremely rigorous verification. Otherwise, it's worthless. And if we give him a worthless deal that can't in any meaningful way be enforced, then he has won because he's got the diplomatic recognition, he's got the nuclear arsenal, and he's got the meeting with the President of the United States. So it's not over. But I think the key point is that we've got a lot further under this president than we got under his predecessor. In the space of 8 years, the Obama administration achieved nothing. At the end of its time in office, it was still claiming that North Korea was, 5 years away from having intercontinental ballistic missiles and miniaturized nuclear warheads. It turned out to be 5 months away from it. So considering the mess that Trump inherited on this question from President Obama, he's done really well.
If he solves this crisis, how big of a victory, foreign policy terms, in history would that be? I mean, what is the last victory that is comparable to that?
This has been compared, I think, rightly with the Cuban Missile Crisis, though it's played out more slowly. And in some ways the stakes are lower because the missiles in the early 60s were very close to the United States. And the risk of escalation to full thermonuclear war between the superpowers, that was really high. The stakes are lower in the North Korean missile crisis, but it had a similar quality to it in that we suddenly realized they were way further down the line with their program than we had thought. They actually had missiles that could target American allies, maybe even American territory. And I think since that realization dawned, the Trump administration did two things right that completely eluded its predecessor. Number one, it credibly threatened military force. Fire and Fury, before Michael Wolff appropriated it for his best-selling work of fiction, was a threat of military action by the United States against North Korea. And in his time as National Security Advisor, H.R. McMaster made that threat credible. So did Jim Mattis at Defense.
Did bringing Bolton in help, you think? Did that scare the North Koreans?
No, I think the work had already been done. I think they already believed that this was going to happen, and so did the South Koreans, which is one reason that they moved. But the other thing that the Trump administration got right was that it successfully got the Chinese to squeeze the windpipe of the North Korean economy. And that, I think, was just as important. And notice, while some people may worry about the trade war, when it came to North Korea, the US and China cooperated pretty well through the UN Security Council. Credit to Nikki Haley, she did a great job. Those resolutions translated into real pressure on the North Korean economy. They were basically running out of hard currency. I think that's why Kim Jong-un had to fold. I don't think without that pressure he would have done what he's done. I think he would just have carried on testing missiles and building them. So I think it's a pretty meaningful breakthrough, but as in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis, we mustn't confuse optics with realities. President Trump excels at optics, and I am sure that he will make the most of his summit meeting with Kim Jong-un, and it'll be wall-to-wall on cable TV. And I think it'll be widely interpreted as a big win, whatever the small print says. That was the same in the case of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It looked like Kennedy had got the other guy to blink, had got Khrushchev to back down. Nobody knew that they'd done a deal to trade missiles to get that breakthrough. So the optics, I'm sure, will turn out well. I think both sides are incentivized for the optics to be good for Trump. The North Koreans want them to look good. The Chinese want him to look good. They care about the detail much more than about the headlines because they decide what the headlines are in their media. I mean, if the North Koreans decide not to cover the summit at all, North Korean citizens won't know anything about it. So we'll get great headlines. The devil will lie in the detail and the enforcement of any verification procedures that are set up. Are they going to give up their nuclear weapons entirely? It seems highly unlikely to me. In fact, I'd be stunned if that happened. If they really did renounce nuclear weapons, then it would be a massive win for Trump. But I don't think that they need to do that to give him enough of a win for cable news.
Saudi Arabia, a lot is going on there. What do you make of what Prince Salman is doing? Are you optimistic that he can transform Saudi Arabia? Do you think that's what he's trying to do? Have you met him by chance?
I have not met him. I have met some of his close advisors. I, of course, was skeptical at first because it looks like an unreformable old regime. And as Tocqueville said, the worst time for a bad regime is when it tries to reform itself. I have been very impressed by how far he has gone. Not only on economic reform, but perhaps more importantly in taking on the clergy on a range of social religious issues. So I am a fan, much more than I was at the outset. I think I am also a fan of the US strategy, which has essentially been to do 180-degree turn relative to the Obama administration, stop cozying up to the Iranians and rebuild the relationships with our core key allies in the region, Israel in particular, but also the Saudis, not to mention the Emiratis. I think that makes much more sense. Obama's policy never made any sense to me unless you had a naive view that the Iranian regime was magically going to liberalize inside a decade. So I think the strategy from a US perspective of backing Mohammed bin Salman makes sense. Indeed, helping him, because he needs help. He's doing some very difficult things. He's in a mess in Yemen. He's not going to get out of that mess without our help. So I think the only skepticism I have at this point is about the proposition that the Saudi economy can be transformed. That just seems really unlikely, given the extraordinary reliance that society has on the rents from oil. I've heard all kinds of impressive Harvard Business School cases and McKinsey-style documents about how to transform the Saudi economy, and I've never been persuaded by those stories. I think that's almost impossible to achieve, especially if the price of oil keeps going back up. Because the thing about it is that the incentive to change the system is inversely correlated with that price. And as we rise above $70, I think the pressure is off to do really radical things. The key question is, can Iran be rolled back? Can it be rolled back not just in economic terms? Can it be rolled back in terms of its incessant meddling in other countries? And that's a difficult job. Once again, it can't be done by the Arabs without American support. But I think the right thing, and I'm pretty clear that this will be top of John Bolton's agenda, is to do that and to turn the tables on Iran, which had been winning the strategic battle for the post-American Middle East pretty much every year of the Obama presidency.
Let's go right to closing questions. I know you're time constrained. What historical leader do you most admire?
Oh, I have such a boring answer to that question. I'm ashamed of it. It's Churchill.
It's the right answer.
But I mean, how could one give another answer? I remember when I was very young reading one of A.J.P. Taylor's books. I think it's his English history in the Oxford series. And he has a simple footnote when Churchill's first mentioned. And the footnote is just the saviour of his nation. You don't need to go to the movie Darkest Hour to appreciate, I haven't yet seen it, to appreciate that Churchill was the saviour not only of his nation, but of Western civilization. Without Churchill's exceptional courage, his ability to lead and his grasp of the English language, it's hard to believe that Britain would have survived 1940 and gone on to be victorious in World War II. Much as I would like to come up with a more original answer to your question, that is the heartfelt answer. And as somebody who has moved from one end of the English-speaking world to the other, from the west of Scotland to the west of the United States, I realize that I am, to an extraordinary extent, a beneficiary of Churchill's vision, which was Anglo-American. He was, after all, the son of an American mother. He always thought in terms of the English-speaking peoples, and he understood that civilization would endure even after the British Empire had gone the way of all empires. So I owe him, and I think my family owes him, and I think even my left-leaning grandfather, who I'm sure never voted Conservative and almost certainly voted Labour in 1945, were he here listening to me, would be nodding in agreement.
Are there 3 books that you can point to that you think most shaped your worldview?
Yes. The first is War and Peace by Tolstoy, which certainly made me into an historian, because I don't think I would necessarily have become a historian if it hadn't been for the concluding coda, the epilogue of War and Peace. Secondly, The Good Soldier Schweik, which is one of the funniest books ever written. Hašek had this great feel for Central Europe and its comic aspect. And I guess I was drawn from the Anglosphere into Middle Europa partly by books like that. And then I think I should give A.J.P. Taylor the bronze medal. I was the son of a doctor and a physics teacher. There weren't many history books on the shelves at home, but there was one, and that was Taylor's Illustrated History of the First World War, which is a wonderful book. Firstly, it's entirely chronological in its structure. He tells it year by year. Secondly, as its name suggests, it has terrific photographs. But the best thing about the photographs are the captions that Taylor wrote, which epitomize the kind of pithy, acerbic, ironical writing that I most enjoy in history.
Is there a writer, or are there writers that when you see their byline, you always read their work?
Yes. Interestingly, because I don't know him at all, I now read Kevin Williamson, and I've done that for a while, even before the controversy of his Atlantic hiring and firing. He's a terrifically good writer. Barry Weiss has become a must-read since she came on the radar. I mean, I could go on at tedious length. Jonah Goldberg always makes me laugh. I'm actually a very loyal National Review reader. I read it the way when I lived in the UK, I read The Spectator, almost as a kind of end-of-the-week fix. It's up there with the first glass of wine. So I'll go on. Charles Murray, a public intellectual who's attracted an appalling amount of abuse and misrepresentation, writes brilliantly, always bravely and insightfully. And if I see my wife's name, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I tend to read her stuff too.
She'll be my next guest on the show. Is there any question I should ask her that you would?
I can think of many.
Final question. Is there any issue that you think is undercovered by the press?
Yeah. I think because of the press's excessive focus on the personality of Donald Trump, it has entirely forgotten to think about the structure of politics. And the structure of politics matters much more than the personality of the president stroke monarch. Journalists write now as if we inhabit a monarchy, and we don't. We inhabit a republic with a highly complex system of government and bureaucracy. So the thing that is absent from media coverage is a good analysis of and understanding of the structure of politics. And caricature terms like deep state don't help us. I did a bit of work on this as part of The Square in the Tower, a network analysis of the Trump administration, an attempt to understand the structure of politics in Trump's first year. And that, for me, was revelatory because when one stopped thinking about the personality and started thinking about the structure of politics, it looked a lot less strange as a presidency. Actually looked a lot like Bill Clinton's first year, but with different names on the characters, but similar behaviors and a similar structure of politics. So I do think this has become a real problem for American journalists. And I'm not sure how they can cure themselves because writing about him is itself addictive, just as reading about his antics is addictive. But it is a total distortion of the way the American political system works. It is designed to be ruled by laws, not by men. And even when the man at the top is extraordinarily colourful and fascinating, we should not forget about the structure of politics.
Niall, thank you so much for doing this show.
Jamie, my pleasure.